Welcome to Kaleidoscope. Let's talk.
So we're seated here at the longest installation or at the Galleliteraryfestival, The Cube by South Beach Valley-Gama, and we're upping the ante with our latest guest at GLF, Sir Alexander McCall Smith. Formerly Professor of Medical Law at the University of Edinburgh, he served as an expert on medical law on several British and international committees. He is, however, best known for his works of fiction. He has sold over 40 million copies of his books, which have been translated into 46 languages. He created the #1 Ladies Detective Agency series, the Dollhousing Mysteries series, and the 44 Scotland Street series, which is also the longest running serial novel in the world. He also wrote a serialized online novel, Corduroy Mansions, and has a remarkable resume of brilliant fiction to his name. He's the co-founder of the Really Terrible Orchestra. And he's with me on Kaleidoscope Let's Talk today. Welcome to Sri Lanka. How has our little island been treating you?
Well, very well, as always. I'm always very happy to be in Sri Lanka, which I think is the most beautiful country. And people are very nice. So what more do you need? I don't think you need anything else.
Would you live in southern Sri Lanka?
Well, yes. I think it's the sort of place that I'd be very happy to live in, because I think it's very interesting. I think that's the main criterion, as far as I'm concerned, is somewhere which has a lot of human interest in it. So I very much enjoy visiting it, and indeed I could imagine living here very, very comfortably. I find often when I'm abroad, I say to myself, yes, that's a place I could live. I live in Scotland, and that's my particular place. But I can understand how many people come to Sri Lanka and think this would be a very nice place to be.
And so your new book came out on Valentine's Day. It's about a marriage bureau, right?
I'm very interested in the subject of friendship and relationships. That occurs obviously in all my books. People are involved with other people. And the idea of matchmaking is an intriguing one. People in some societies, you have official matchmakers who make it their business to bring people together. In other societies, it may be friends who do that incidentally. But it's a really important part of human life, I think, is the bringing people together and hoping that people who are looking for somebody may be persuaded that this is the person for them, or they may help them to find the right person.
But that's not the essence of your story. Yours is very, very funny. There's a bit of 40 Towers in it, I think.
Well, I think that things can go wrong with matchmaking. I have in this particular series of books, this is the first book in a series, introduced the reader to a company which helps people to meet other people, called the Perfect Passion Company. Now, with a title like that, I think one would have to be quite careful.
All these detective stories that you have written all your life almost, what is the heart of a detective story?
My detective stories aren't about crime, really. They're rather unusual. They're about people, in particular one private detective, Mara Matsui in Botswana, people who help people with problems in their lives. And I think that's rather interesting, that there are people in society who will help others to sort out their personal difficulties, and Mara Matsui is one such. So I don't really deal with crime as such, but I deal with problems.
Does your medical law field sort of enter into your detective stories?
A bit. Not to a very great extent, but inevitably what one's been doing in one's professional life can have an effect on what one does as a writer.
So what made you get into fiction writing after being a professor of medical law?
Well, I've always wanted to write, and I wrote as a child and then as a young man, and so I just continued with that. And I take great delight in telling a story, really. I mean, that's what being a novelist is. It's telling a story to people.
You are the co-founder of the Really Terrible Orchestra, which actually came from the fact that you say you play a really terrible bassoon. How did the whole thing come about?
Well, my wife and I decided to form an orchestra for people who'd like to be in an orchestra but who aren't good enough. And there are lots of people in that category. So we set up this orchestra, which would have a name that wouldn't put people off. Because if you're going to join something called the Really Terrible Orchestra, you're not going to be too worried about not being very good. And we discovered there were a lot of people who wanted to play in an orchestra, but they were very weak musicians. And that's what we've done, and it's been a great success. It doesn't sound very good, but that's not the point.
You've toured New York, you've toured Europe, and what has the feedback been like?
People get the joke. They love watching a group of adults failing to play very well, and people find that very entertaining and amusing. So we get a very good response.
So when you put your plots together, and as you keep writing, have things gone terribly wrong at some stage or the other?
Well, sometimes with a plot, the plot can change really quite radically after you've started it. Sometimes I've found myself in a situation where I've got the characters into a bit of a pickle and I have to work out how to get them out. But generally speaking, they resolve well enough.
The #1 ladies detective agency, you're a man writing about women. Where do you get the insight from?
Well, I think by observing people. I think as a novelist, you look at other people, you listen to what they say, you hear about them, and you have to have that curiosity in order to write a novel. So I just get that from my observation of life, listening to people, hearing what their issues are, discussing things with them, and that gives you plenty of material.
What are the must-haves when you are actually writing?
Well, I certainly don't need that when I'm writing. I tend to have a cup of red bush tea, rooibos tea, which I like very much indeed. So tea is more my thing. I think here, as a special treat, I might allow myself something like a Diet Coke, which is just a temporary measure. My real choice would be tea. I'm a great fan of tea, and indeed I've visited tea estates in Sri Lanka on past visit, which was absolutely fascinating.
Are you a sort of pen to paper kind of writer, or have you gone into computers?
Computers. I use a word processor. I still use a notebook and a pen for some purposes. When I'm writing poetry, I tend to do it with a fountain pen, and I'll use the notebook also for jotting down ideas. But when it comes to the actual prose of the book, I tend now to use a word processor because it's so easy.
You spoke about poetry. You read a poem about language used on airplanes. Tell me, how did that trigger?
Well, there I was on an airplane and I was reflecting on the language that they use in aviation, the words that they use when they address the passengers. It's a really very stilted form of English. They rather like to use formal terms, and I wondered what it would sound like if the pilot was a bit of a poet and used poetic descriptions to talk about the clouds and the airplane and the whole business of landing. And so I wrote the poem on the plane, and it's called The Language of Pilots, and I had great fun with it.
Your books have been translated into 46 languages. Do you worry about the fact that the essence of your book will get lost in translation?
That's always an issue, and of course one can never tell, because usually you can't understand or appreciate the language into which they're translated. So you really have to rely on your translator and hope that the translator makes a good job of it. And generally speaking, they do. Translators take their job very seriously, and they want to find out about the special terms that you use and the context of the book. So I very much hope that they manage to capture the flavour of the original, and I think generally speaking they do.
So now when you write a novel, it goes from the beginning to the end in one flow. Now you wrote a serialized online novel and wrote it through The Scotsman. Yes. What major differences do you notice between this method of writing and actually writing a novel?
That's a very interesting question. I think with a novel which has been published chapter by chapter in a newspaper, as you write it, you have to observe different requirements of structure. So I write those in chapters of 1,200 words, which is about the right size for a novel of that sort. And there's a different structure to such a novel. I tend to have episodes of 3 chapters, and then I move to different characters and then return to the original characters later on. So there is that particular structure, which is different from the structure of the ordinary novel.
What's your writing process like? Are you sort of a rigid writer who'll wake up every morning, sit at your computer, or do you sort of, is it fluid?
You have to be, as a writer, you have to be disciplined, and you actually have to sit at your desk. I think if you think that you can sit there and wait for the muse to come and tap you on the shoulder, you're going to be waiting a long time because the muse is otherwise engaged. So you must have a routine, and I have a routine. So I write for 2 or 3 hours a day, and I do it by sitting down at the desk and going straight at it.
I do know that some of your work is inspired from your time in Africa. Would your time here inspire a novel about Sri Lanka?
Well, I would certainly, it's the sort of place that I would, it's suggestive of fiction because it's very interesting and the people will have a very interesting story, I think, if one listens to it. So I did write a book in which part of it takes place in this country in its previous existence, and then it moves to Britain thereafter, and the plot is subsequently developed. But the first scenes are on a tea estate in Sri Lanka. But I'd have to be very careful because I don't know the country well enough to really to write very much about it. And I think you have to be careful. You have to really know what you're writing about. And I don't know the country well enough now, other than to make sort of fairly passing reference to it.
So besides the Marriage Bureau book coming out in February, what else are we to expect from you?
I've finished another novel which will be published in June, which is a self-standing novel. And I'm currently working on volume 25 of the #1 latest detective agency. So that's the next book in the Botswana series. And then there'll be a Scotland Street book and so on. My work, I'm afraid, is never done.
How do you keep it relevant? How do you keep the reader wanting more?
I think that's a very good question. And so you have to be aware of that when you're writing. You have to say to yourself, is this something which is going to engage the attention of the reader? And I think the best way of doing that is to ask yourself, does it engage my own attention? If it does, then that's okay. But if you find yourself yawning or getting bored with what you're writing, that's a sure sign that you've got to change.
Do enjoy Sri Lanka, and we're hoping to see you again very soon.
Thank you very much indeed.
And if you like what we've got for you, don't forget to subscribe and follow us on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, and LinkedIn.